breezy and wet day today, so I'm pleased. And for those of you who are coming from off campus especially, thank you so much for being here and sharing this community with us that we're trying to build at Georgia Tech. So this talk is happening under the auspices of the Global Change Program, which I think just passed its 6-month birthday on campus. So it's a brand new program. It really aspires to engage and reach out to students, and thank you to all the students who came to the discussion with Dr. Wilkinson. It also really aspires to build capacity for scalable climate solutions, both in Atlanta and beyond. And so this is our big, big mission that we have on this campus. So you all are now officially part of that. So thank you for being part of that. We have a website if you're interested in learning more, globalchange.tech.edu. Whether you're a student, or faculty, or staff, or even a member of the public, we'd love to hear from you about what you would like to see with the program and how you might like to engage. So please, we're here to continue to build this community, to continue to celebrate the, right, is this supposed to be me? Oh, well, anyway. I think I'm pretty loud, but the live stream folks didn't catch my glowing introductory remarks about the Global Change Program. Okay, so without further ado, I'll move to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Katharine Wilkinson. She comes to us from Project Drawdown, where she is the Vice President of Communication and Engagement and played a lead role in writing the book, wrote the book on Drawdown, right? Literally, and so that book is on sale outside the back wall across the atrium here, and so encourage you to pick up a copy, and you could go through in depth some of that solution space and see where Georgia Tech might resonate, where you resonate, and Katharine has also offered to sign those copies today too, so I'm going to have to acquire another copy myself, it seems, get it signed by Katharine. And so a little bit about Katharine as she comes to us from Project Drawdown. She has a doctorate in geography and environment from Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and a BA in religion from SUNY, the University of the South. And prior to this role, she had a number of other engagements, she speaks internationally, but her prior engagement was a director of strategy at the Purpose Consultancy Bright House, and also the Boston Consulting Group and Natural Resources Defense Council. She's also taught at University of Oxford and Agnes Scott. And right now, in her current role, she's an author, a strategist, and of course, a speaker. I saw her as well at Agnes Scott last year, some of you also as well. And she is the lead writer. This is the Drawdown is the New York Times best-selling book, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. And it's her second book, because her first book was Between God and Green, How Evangelicals Are Cultivating a Middle Ground on Climate Change, which also sounds very relevant to the space today as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Katharine Wilkinson to present to us today about Drawdown. Thanks.
How are you all feeling on this rainy, cold day? Okay-ish? Better now. Thank you, Kim. It's really wonderful to feel like kind of like an early guest of the Global Change Program. That feels very exciting. So how many of you are aware of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out just a few weeks ago? Familiar? How many of you found yourselves feeling some mixture of sad, anxious, afraid, alarmed, angry, apathetic? Some feelings about that? How many of you found yourself wondering, what should we or I do? And how many of you felt like you knew where to go to find those answers? So that's sort of like denouement of raised hands, gives you a sense of why Project Drawdown exists and why we came into being. So if you missed the report, the gist is The evidence is overwhelming. We are in a situation of urgency, severity, and scope that humankind has never faced, and so far, our response is not anywhere close to adequate. Right, great, that's the problem statement. And even when I say that, I can sort of feel myself deflate. That report is the latest artifact of this incredible body of scientific work that has been done to map out the challenge of climate change. And mostly what we've been doing is repeating that problem statement over and over and over again at higher and higher volume and frequency, with the intention of sparking folks to action, but often leaving them feeling sad, anxious, afraid, angry, etc. Right? A whole host of responses that are, hardwired in our beings, but are not very helpful if you're looking for forward movement and bold action. And Drawdown came into being because we saw this gap that humanity has lacked a comprehensive and compelling and accessible path forward to answer this really robust problem statement. We have lacked a vision of possibility in the face of a seemingly impossible challenge. So that is what we set out to do, to create a rigorous vision of possibility, to fill that gap, to map a path forward, to tell another side of the story. We have done that with not a lot of money, but a lot of very committed folks. So we are a very small core team, but then this wonderful international and interdisciplinary collaborative that has included to date more than 75 researchers from 6 continents and more than 30 countries. We have about 120 advisors who are experts in all different dimensions of climate science, policy, advocacy, action, and together we have brought this blueprint of possibility to life, to actually move towards ending and ultimately potentially reversing global warming. If you want to end and possibly reverse the warming that is happening on this planet, the really critical threshold on that journey is drawdown. This is where our name comes from. Drawdown means, very simply, the point in time when atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases peak and begin to steadily decline. So I was in Jackson, Mississippi last October in an auditorium that went up like this, full of 8th graders, which is a deeply terrifying experience for me. But we were looking at this graph of the fluctuations in carbon dioxide concentrations over the last 400,000 years, and saying, all right, so if this is the challenge that we're facing, what do we want to do? And this one sort of very bold young man stood up and said, right? That's drawdown. And I think it's incredibly helpful to have an aspiration in mind about climate action and what success would look like that you can explain with a hand motion and a sort of cartoon noise. For most folks, right, parts per million and 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, like these are sort of concepts that we can't really, at least I'll speak for myself, I can't really wrap my head around in any kind of visceral way. But this idea that if we are heading the wrong direction towards a cliff, we don't just want to get to that cliff more slowly. We actually want to turn around and head back the other way. This is an area where Drawdown is putting forward a different kind of goal than we often hear, right? We hear this word mitigation a lot. I'm a bit of a word nerd, so forgive me, you'll get a little etymology sprinkled in along the way. But the meaning of the word mitigate is to lessen an evil or a difficulty. Like, yeah, let's get out and mitigate. I don't know, it's not so inspiring. There are many of these areas where terminology that is helpful in science and research and policy does not translate into an effective communication strategy for the broader public. And that's one of the areas where I think it's helpful to be a little bit reflective about the language that we use. The big takeaway here is that we are already living in terra nova. So human beings have never survived within these atmospheric conditions before. So getting to drawdown isn't just like, well, that would be great. Getting to drawdown is about hitting a threshold and heading back to conditions that we know are most conducive for life on this planet. We think that's a goal worth going for. It's a big goal, but what we discovered as we got into this work is that human beings have actually been creating a plan to get to drawdown. We just didn't realize that that's what we had been doing because we have been operating, frankly, more like an ecosystem. Folks have been out in laboratories, companies, forests, farms, backyards, halls of government, testing ideas, learning what works, what doesn't, refining and trying again. And along the way, we've built up this incredible body of research and data about all of these basically tools that are in our toolbox. So our job at Project Drawdown wasn't to invent a plan to get to drawdown. It was actually to gather and codify the collective wisdom of humanity and then reflect that back to us, to really bring into one place this incredible diversity of technologies and practices that we already have, we're already using, they're commonly available, at least in some places, they're economically viable, and they're scientifically valid. And they range from the usual suspects, some of which you probably see here, to some relative unknowns and some totally unsung heroes. And I think that's the power of bringing together the kind of interdisciplinary team that we did with an openness to looking into every corner for what works and bringing that all into one place. Drawdown includes solutions that both avoid sending greenhouse gas emissions up, but also a whole host of solutions that bring carbon back home through photosynthesis. Most of our attention, right, is on the red X. How do we stop emissions from going up? But we know that that is not enough, even if we totally broke that arrow. We also have to be bringing carbon back home to where it came from, right? Sometimes I feel sort of bad for carbon because I think it kind of becomes this like evil villain in the story of climate change, right? And it's like, you know, I was just like hanging out, you know, under the surface of the earth, and then you guys sent me up, you know, you burned me and sent me up into the skies. Carbon isn't bad. Carbon is a vital building block of life. And the issue is about balance. And it's about what we have done with this, frankly, incredible material, as well as other greenhouse gases, of course. So we think about maximizing both sides of this equation. This is one of my, has become one of my favorite solutions, which I'm a vegetarian. This is sort of an odd solution to love, but SILVOPASTURE comes from the Latin for forest and grazing. That tells you, frankly, most of what you need to know about SILVOPASTURE. It is the integration of livestock and trees into systems that turn out to be great for farmers because they are more resilient to extreme weather and drought. You may have a fruit or a nut crop that you're raising at the same time as you are raising animals for meat or dairy. When it comes to climate and to carbon, the kicker is that if you compare a pasture with trees to a pasture without trees, the pasture with trees will sequester 5 to 10 times more carbon. So much that it far outweighs any of the methane emissions from the animals living on that system. As you can see here, it also has potentially a huge upside for farmers. If we scaled the practice of silvopasture in a vigorously but plausibly over the next 30 years, farmers could see almost $700 billion in additional revenue. I don't know about you guys, but from what I hear, farmers could use some additional revenue. This is actually something we have a lot of in Georgia, silvopasture. I'll just kind of speak briefly to these different key pieces of our analysis that you'll see. The first, not surprisingly, is the emissions impact that a given solution can have, as I said, if scaled globally over 30 years. So that globally piece is critical. All of our modeling is done at a global scale, and it's a systems model. So if you allocate land for silvopasture, it can't also be land for regenerative agriculture or reforestation or something else. Some of the solutions impact carbon dioxide. Some of them impact multiple greenhouse gases. Some of them impact methane or hydrofluorocarbons. What we've done is translate them into their carbon dioxide equivalent so that we can do this apples to apples comparison of the solutions. And that's what drives the ranking of the solutions 1 to 80 in this case. A gigaton, does everyone know? Anyone not know what a gigaton is? Anyone want to explain what a gigaton is? Okay, so a gigaton is 1 billion tons. And I think this slide is actually a helpful one for this. So a cow weighs about a ton. So a gigaton is 1 billion cows worth of carbon dioxide. I can't really conceptualize 1 billion cows, so we're sort of doing a little bit of kind of chicken scratchy math. If you packed cows side by side by side by side, 1 billion cows would fill Rhode Island. And last year we emitted about 37 gigatons of carbon dioxide, so 37 billion cows worth. It still sort of boggles the mind, but at any rate. We also looked at the financial side, the economic side of these solutions. So the net cost looks at the net cost to implement a solution. So if you're gonna put a silvopasture system in place compared to a regular treeless pasture system, what's the additional cost you're going to incur to put that system into place? Or what's the additional cost to purchase an electric vehicle as opposed to a gasoline powered car? And then as you operate that solution over 30 years, how much money do you save? Or in this case, how much more money do you earn as a farmer? And in most cases, there is some net cost to implement. In some cases, there's actually implementing the solutions is cheaper. And then in most cases, you see a big upside over 30 years. This is what the solutions look like when you map them out. If anyone remembers the Princeton wedges work, what I think is really interesting is that, to me, this looks a lot more like nature, right? This looks like the shape of a shell. This looks like the way things sort of naturally come into being. And frankly, the solutions are ranked not because we're going to pick some and leave the others, right? This is sort of the era of BuzzFeed and top 10 lists, and people love rankings, right? So there's some kind of communication appeal there. But we need all of these solutions and then some, and they work together, as I said, as a system. They're interconnected, and they're all vital. And I think what's also really exciting when you start to look at the fuller set of drawdown solutions is that you begin to see footholds for every person, every community, every institution on the planet. And that's also very different than a lot of the work on what we are to do about climate change, where individuals are told to change light bulbs and cross your fingers that the powers that be figure out how to fulfill the Paris Agreement, right? And it's like, well, where's the interim space there? I couldn't possibly talk about all of these solutions. There are 80 in the core models of our work, and then there are also another 20 what we call coming attractions in the book, so more nascent solutions. But I'll just take you through a few of them and some kind of key insights from our work, and then we can dive in wherever you're keen to. This, I think, is a surprise for a lot of folks. Reduced food waste came in the top 5 solutions. Around the world, a third of the food that we produce is not consumed, and it's about 40% in the US, even as hunger is a condition of life for roughly 800 million people around the world, and food insecurity for even more than that. We're investing resources in food at every stage of its journey, right? Growing it, harvesting it, processing it, shipping it, storing it, packaging it, cooking it, maybe like throwing it in the back of the refrigerator and forgetting about it. And so that whole journey that food goes on has emissions implications. And then oftentimes, uneaten food ends up in a landfill where it generates methane. So because of all these kind of different dimensions of the journey of food, you have this huge opportunity. And the biggest contributor actually to the size of this number is that we are cutting down forests to grow more food that we don't eat. So reducing food waste is actually a stop deforestation solution. Also really interesting, I think, in the top 5, what we came to call plant-rich diets. So we tried to be relatively conservative in how we did our modeling, right? So if we assumed that the whole world goes vegan, this number would be higher, but that is highly unlikely to happen, right? It is plausible that the world comes into a healthier diet, that in parts of the world like ours, where we dramatically overconsume animal protein such that it's creating lots of chronic disease issues, that comes down. And also that in parts of the world where nutrition is not sufficient, that maybe animal consumption, dairy and meat consumption goes up. But net across the world, we come into a healthier plant-rich diet. I don't know if there are any Michael Pollan fans, but this is basically the math of eat food, not too much, mostly plants. This is an area where we have an opportunity to have huge benefits for health and well-being at the same time as we solve climate change. Reducing food waste, we have an opportunity to address food insecurity at the same time as we address emissions. So you'll see this again and again in the drawdown solutions that, yes, the thing that we're calculating here is emissions, but there are these many, many positive ripple effects. Food actually turns out to be the largest sector of potential impact over the next 30 years. It's 8 of the top 20 solutions and just over 320 gigatons of impact. And that's because with food, you're playing on both sides of that equation, right? So you're avoiding sending emissions up with things like reducing food waste and shifting to plant-rich diets, and through a whole host of regenerative agriculture practices like silvopasture, you're actively bringing carbon back home. So this is often a surprise for folks, like, whoa, I thought climate change was an energy problem that needs energy solutions. And it is that in huge part. But food also is a really, really critical area of action. Energy. Anyone want to take a guess on when the first rooftop solar system was installed?
Question to your question. Do you actually mean PV, photovoltaic?
I do mean, well, they were not calling it PV then, but yes.
I believe it was in the late 1800s that the first electric solar system was installed.
You are the first person who has ever gotten this even remotely right. So kudos to Georgia Tech. Yeah, the first solar prototype went up on a rooftop in New York in 1884, and it was selenium at that time, not silicon until I think the 1950s. But what's really fascinating to me about that story, and this guy Charles Fritz was the sort of tinkerer experimenter who put this up, and he called it photoelectric modules. And Thomas Edison had just brought the first coal-fired power plant online 2 years before. And yet Fritz was absolutely convinced that solar would someday wind up competing with coal-fired power. And I just love this idea that human beings have been hard at work on these solutions for a hell of a lot longer than we think about. And some of them, like silvopasture, are ancient practices that we've just abandoned in a lot of places along the way that simply need to be revived. We use this photo in the book because we wanted to tell the story of some of the co-benefits of distributed energy. So there are still 1.1 billion people around the world without access to electricity. And the idea that we're going to build the electric grid to address that need is both sort of insanely expensive and pretty improbable. So this is an Uru family who live on Lake Titicaca, and they've just gotten a solar panel and storage system that means for the first time, these girls will not be doing their homework by kerosene lamp, which has an emissions impact, but more importantly, it has a health impact because kerosene is extremely bad for indoor air pollution, and it has follow-on ripple effects for their education and their well-being through the rest of their lives. I love this guy as well. We had a lot of fun picking out imagery for the book, and this is a offshore wind farm, as you can tell, off the coast of England, and this is an actual athlete in training, which I think is great. We split on and offshore wind because the economics of the two are very different, but if you add them up, wind would also be right at the top of the list of solutions. Energy, specifically electricity generation, is 5 of the top 20 solutions, and then the second largest sector of impact overall. Then there's a whole category that we looked at around non-agricultural land use. The Irish poet Seamus Heaney wrote some great poems about bogs in Ireland, and in one of them he describes the ground itself is kind black butter, which I just think is great. Peatlands are layers and layers and layers of decomposing organic matter. So they're about 50% carbon, and they're under threat in various parts of the world from farming, forestry, fire, and they're only 3% of the Earth's land area, but they hold twice as much carbon as all of the world's forests. So a really concentrated problem on the one hand, or a really concentrated opportunity for more protection and restoration of peatlands around the world. I love this guy too. This is kind of, you're just sort of getting like my most beloved photos. This is a Kermode bear in the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia, which is one of the most incredible success stories around forest protection in recent years. We split up protecting forests, restoring temperate forests, restoring tropical forests, but this one's my favorite image. This guy is a bike mechanic in Berlin. He's taking their latest electric bike model out for a ride. Electric bikes are the fastest growing segment of alternative fuel vehicles globally. They are all the rage in China, so we should probably replace him with a more evocative and fact-based image. They have, of course, emissions advantages over cars and actually even some forms of mass transit. And critically, they overcome some of the limitations of traditional bicycles, right? Have you ever tried to ride a bike in San Francisco, for example? Mike's like, yes, I have. Mike is like a fanatic bike commuter. So maybe for like the average Joe or Josephine, the limitations of bikes. They help us get by bike more quickly and maybe without showing up super sweaty and gross. This is the number one, refrigeration. This was not the sexiest number one that we could have ended up with, but this is focused on better managing leaks and disposal of the refrigerant chemicals that are in our air conditioning units, refrigerators, cold chains. The main refrigerant in use is hydrofluorocarbons, which came into use after the Montreal Protocol phased out the use of chlorofluorocarbons. So on the one hand, HFCs are great because they have almost no negative impact on the ozone layer, but they turn out to be incredibly potent greenhouse gases, 1,000 times or more as effective as carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. So really big opportunity to not have them escape at the end of, for example, the life of a refrigerator. There are a whole set of solutions that we looked at around buildings and cities and infrastructure. This one I love. This is a green roof on top of a hospital in Basel, Switzerland. And green roofs are A, really cool, B, can create more green space in cities. They can reduce the urban heat island effect, but from our perspective and what's calculated here is the impact they have on reducing the loads for heating and electricity in buildings, because they're these super insulators that both keep too much heat out and keep desired heat in. And then there's a sector of our work that is not typically present in most discussions of what do we do about climate change. And that's a sector that we call women and girls. There are just 3 solutions. One looking at the gender gap in agriculture, specifically for smallholder farmers. And then educating girls in family planning, which really go hand in hand. So around the world today, there are still 130 million girls who are denied their basic right to attend school. That has so many implications for lives and possibilities. I won't go into to all of them. It turns out that education also has a ripple effect on emissions. And that's because, for a variety of reasons, with more years of education, women choose to marry later and have smaller families. So one by one by one, securing the right of girls to go to school over time will have a big impact on how many human beings are living on this planet at mid-century. Of course, if you want to manage the size and spacing of your family, you need to have some means to do that. And that's why education and access to high-quality voluntary reproductive health care work together. Still in the US today, 45% of pregnancies are unintended, which is kind of shocking. And around the world, 214 million women say they want to decide whether and when to become pregnant but are not using contraception. So this is really about meeting the needs that women express and ending up having an impact on how many people live on Earth and need to eat and use transport and build buildings and use electricity and goods and all the rest. But they are really solutions that begin and end with rights, and they just happen to also have this impact on climate. This is my goddaughter. She's a little older than in this picture. She just turned 7. And I think about her a lot because what the IPCC report just sort of reaffirmed is that we have about a decade to radically reshape society. So that's right about the time that Harrison will be finishing high school. And on the one hand, for me, that's terrifying because that just doesn't feel that far away. And on the other hand, it's incredibly exciting because it means that as she steps out into the world, she could be stepping into a world that is profoundly different than the one we are living in now. The Earth is asking us to take an evolutionary leap forward as a human species. That's how I think about it. And that means it's a really magnificent time to be alive because this is a moment that matters so much. And we have so much opportunity to shape the trajectory of not just human life going forward, but for all life on Earth. So I think I'll leave it there, and then we can do some questions.
We have plenty of time for questions. Is that mic up here? Oh, Kelsey and okay.
Are they floating?
Great. So, yeah. Turn it on. Okay, great. So I just ask that you use the microphone to ask your questions so we can get capture on the live stream for all those viewers out there.
I wonder if you could go back to the food one.
Slide?
Yes. So I've food and climate change, that interaction is my favorite topic. And I have created this slide myself, actually, using your website. Something that I like to talk about is also that if you look at refrigeration, if you look at tropical forests, temperate forest, peatlands, that those aren't specifically under the category of food, but they are largely food-related issues as well. And I was wondering if that was something that y'all have thought about as well, if you talk about, and if you could just talk about that sort of area.
Awesome. It's such a great point, and as there was a group of us, a group of students that we were talking just before this, and one of the things that I really value about younger leaders on climate is the willingness to give truth and correction. So that was very kind, but feel free to give truth and correction as well as ask questions. Yeah, so it's a super, super point that even as things are categorized into solutions and sectors, there's permeability between those things and interconnection between those things. And certainly as we think about the impacts of protecting ecosystems and what that means for moderating climate impacts and the availability of water, right? All of these things that food production is dependent on. I mean, you could just start drawing arrows around and around and around. And and there were definitely areas where we sort of struggled with like, where should this solution sit? And at the end of the day, what we tried to do was to group things and structure things in a way that folks who are not experts could wrap their heads around relatively easily. But I think that kind of the double click, if you will, of, yeah, let's talk about what we mean when we say these solutions interact as a system. What does that look like? And I would love to see what else you've done in terms of visuals on that for food and other solutions. Thank you.
If you can go to the slide on refrigeration.
Yeah.
Is that net savings a negative almost $1 trillion?
Yeah, so it is really expensive to address leaks and disposal of refrigerant chemicals. So this is an area where there is really, really need for government intervention, right? Because there's sort of no way around the spend. But continue with your question.
Well, no, I was making sure
Yeah,
that
you're
wasn't
like,
a typo.
Am I right? Yeah.
So then is that...
I'm sorry to say, but yes,
okay.
it is.
So is that upfront cost?
That is over time. So on the upfront cost, there's just insufficient data. Okay. And that is true in various places in our work where it's sort of like the literature is just not there. But I think we have a pretty good sense of the operational costs of doing this work over time, and so that's where you get, yeah, quite a big spend there instead of a savings.
Have you thought through a solution to this? This is the #1 problem, and of all the other things, this doesn't have this is pure cost. So how do we draw that down?
Will you think about that?
So I want to follow up on the refrigeration too. Given that we're nearing the end of the Montreal Protocol dates,
yeah,
and there doesn't seem to be the political wherewithal to come up with the next, aside from just the leaks, what's the next refrigerant? Because Montreal's done a good job, I think, of protecting the ozone.
Yeah.
But global warming, no.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, so there's also, I think, a whole sort of innovation side to the refrigerant question. So when we were very busy in America focusing on the 2016 elections, the leaders of the world actually did gather in Kigali, Rwanda, and agreed to an amendment to the Montreal Protocol that will, unlike the Paris Agreement, actually has teeth to it. So the countries of the world in sort of 3 waves will be phasing out the use of HFCs over the coming years. But what we phase them out to, right, the replacement is a big question. And I am by no means a refrigerant expert, but there are a number of different approaches that are being tested, and some of them that are being used increasingly in commercial spaces. So CO2 itself is a really effective refrigerant chemical in the right system. And I think there's a huge need for more work in that space.
Do you think there's a place for ammonia?
I feel like that is above my pay grade to make that call, but certainly there are folks who think that there is, I guess assuming we can deal with the like flammability issues. So ammonia is another refrigerant chemical. I learned more about refrigerant systems than I had ever wanted to working on this. Yes, so this number does not include the Kigali impact. It does not include the phase out. This is just leaks and disposal in the interim. Yeah.
Great presentation. The second time I've heard you give this, and even better, I think, today than the last time.
Thank you.
I wanted to continue on the discussion, not necessarily of refrigeration, but related, in that I noticed none of the top 20 opportunities are in the energy efficiency realm. Now, refrigeration you could put there. It would be a smaller contributor and have a positive payback. But you have a lot of the generation, electricity, clean generation options rather than the using less option. One of the things I've been thinking about, some articles I've read recently, including one in Science that Steve Sorrell and Benjamin Sovacool wrote about 6 months ago, talking about bounty programs where you can improve the new generation technologies and then wait for them to displace their competing older versions in the marketplace, or you can go and collect all the old stuff and then let the market figure out what it wants to displace them with. We kind of did that with the compact, with the incandescent bulb. We didn't actually go and collect them. We could have. They do more of that in China. You know, we just said you can't buy anymore. We could, you know, we could actually get out and we could actually go and shut down coal plants and, you know, remove old leaking refrigerators. They do that. There are bounty programs for refrigerators. But just wondering, have you thought, that's more in the policy arena, but it is a way to accelerate where, for instance, globally, adding about 1% per year of solar. So right now it's about a 2.5% or something. It's, you know, 1% more. 1% more of renewables. I'm sorry, I'm going to work on this number. I've got it. 26% of electricity worldwide is from renewable resources. That's 1% more this year than last year, and 1% more than the previous year. It's been like a 1% increase in share, which means that by the year 2100, we will finally have displaced all the non-renewables with renewables. That's partly because we're having to compete with all the old stuff. We're not dragging it out of the marketplace. So have you thought about how that might be done a little more effectively to get some acceleration using the technologies we have at hand today?
Yeah. So now I'm feeling guilty for not having done my reading this week yet on the IEA's, the latest energy outlook, because I would be more prepared with some latest data. But yeah, I think the first thing to say is that on the efficiency piece, this is where I think the rankings are, they're helpful and interesting on the one hand, and they cloud things on the other hand. So on pieces around energy efficiency, we really tried to get down to the specific technology that's moving the needle. And so when you do that, you're kind of breaking down into little buckets, right? Smart thermostats and better windows and more insulation. And when you add all of those up, it's significant. And I think it's where again, it's sort of like the renewable energy gets more of the credit, but it's totally dependent on the gains in efficiency. And that's because when you have renewables, you're doing basically complete swap out, right, of dirty energy for clean. And on the efficiency side, you're sort of making gains, but you may still be stuck with a dirty energy source. So some of that is kind of in the methodology of how our senior fellow in the energy space thought about all of that. The piece around accelerants, I think, is really, really important. Frankly, I would love to see like a companion book to Drawdown that looks at like what are 100 really effective accelerants that are already in place and already proving their worth, and
or the
bounty
100
programs.
Most offensive problems we've got, which are the 100 worst technologies. You've got the 100 best options. What are the worst that we need to,
we need to pull out.
get rid of? Yeah, it's
Cool.
the opposite.
Yeah, like, so instead of drawdown, maybe it would be like boot 'em or something. I like that. Now I'm like, there's all these great, I think, sister books that could be done.
Hi. I have two questions, if I may. Great talk. First question is just, I'm a little surprised that in the wedges, there's no category for transportation.
Oh,
Other than the electric, there's electric vehicles. There's like a couple little guys, but overall, like airplanes and things like that, I thought were pretty huge.
So transportation is also an interesting one where I think the assumptions that we have about it are, you sort of do the math and it turns up some interesting things. And again, mostly that's because you're talking about incremental efficiency gains, better truck fuel economy, better airplane fuel efficiency,
less trips.
But so it's, again, you see when you're not getting kind of a full swap out, it's just a smaller impact. It doesn't mean that it's not absolutely critical. But yeah, I think oftentimes people are like, what do you mean electric vehicles are not in the top 10? And partially that's also because the projections, whether they're right or not, the kind of experts in transport are projecting still a lot of manufacturing of internal combustion vehicles. Maybe that'll change and surprise us in the same way that that kind of cost declines and improvements in solar panels have played out in a way that kind of surpassed the IEA's projections, for example.
Well, thanks. I'm also wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about sequestration.
Yeah.
You focused, rightly so, on the need for forestation, but I'm in the College of Design, and every single second year Master of Architecture student next semester are going to be designing sort of 8 to 10 story buildings only using wood, heavy timber, or glulam structures and calculating the carbon, assuming that those are harvested only from fallen down trees and well managed, coupled with sort of reforestation. And there's a kind of, but this is really something quite new for us to be thinking about.
Yeah.
Tell me just sort of more thoughts on sequestration other than the forestation.
So building with wood is one of the coming attractions, actually. The use of cross-laminated timber and glulams. Part of the reason that it's in the coming attractions bucket is not because it's not already proven, but because the research, there's just not a sufficient body of literature there yet. So it's one of those solutions that I think is like, it's currently sits in coming attractions and will relatively quickly tip into one of the modeled solutions. And part of that is the sequestration potential, right? So dry wood is about 50% carbon. So assuming, as you've said, that it's coming from responsible afforestation practice, you can imagine that then buildings become carbon storehouses, right? If you're building skyscrapers that are going to be up for a long time, they can be holding on to quite a lot of carbon. And then the other benefit is that you're not using concrete and steel, which are hugely emissions intensive. And so you get that kind of double benefit. I have forgotten some of these stats, but what is out there in terms of projecting the potential impact of building with wood, it's absolutely enormous. I think it's exciting. Also, wood, it's beautiful, and you look at these images of these buildings, and they're incredible. They're spaces that you want to be in. So there's that as well.
Kind of like our Libby building.
Yes.
Just deserve the last question for one of our students. Okay, or you had your hand up for a while. Let's move up and down, up and down.
So when you were calculating these numbers on savings and cost, were the public health implications considered at all? For example, how green roofs could mitigate deadly heat waves and reduce urban pollution?
This is it's such a great question, and it plays right into kind of the next chapter of Drawdown's work. So these ones don't have numbers. So this, for example, we're only looking at if you're a homeowner and you want to put solar on your roof, what's that going to cost? And then how much money are you going to save on your energy bills? So it's like a super narrow lens at this point. And when you start to think about what are the economic benefits of all of the co-benefits, right? The positive ripple effects, well, that's game changing, right? Health impacts, you mentioned heat waves, but also air pollution is one of the world's deadliest killers. The healthcare costs of excessive meat and dairy consumption, right? You start to add these up and it's like, whoa, this is powerful, right? The impact of educated women, right? And so this is definitely an area where our research team is hoping to expand and deepen the work going forward because we think it's really important for making the case, and that there are still too many, for example, government ministers who sit in, health and think that climate is irrelevant for them, right? And so as we want to be doing more and more kind of multi-solving, right, these things become really important. So thank you, that was a great question and a great way to end, and keep your eyes peeled, not in the super near term, but at some point for this to be added to our work. Yeah.